All your systems are looking good. Recorded. We'll see you on the other side.
London, fall of 1774. King George III and the English Parliament are conducting their normal duties governing over the British Empire when a letter arrives from the colonies in America. The letter is from General Thomas Gage, appointed governor of Massachusetts and commander of the British forces in the Americas. The letter tells of protests, riots, and growing hostilities between the colonial Americans and their rulers. Recent parliamentary acts, known as the Intolerable Acts, have spurred these hostilities and events, like the powder alarm in September of the same year. Events tell General Gage that his forces might be in danger, so he writes to his government, pleading for help.
The whole country is in arms and in motion. From present appearances, there is no prospect of putting the late acts in force, but by first making a conquest of the New England provinces. If you think 10,000 men sufficient, send 20. If 1,000,000 thought enough, give 2. You save both blood and treasure in the end.
The king scoffed at the absurd suggestion and responded by only sending 500 Marines. In the American colonies, hostilities between patriots and the British forces continued to rise after the powder alarm. Open confrontation between the colonial militias and General Gage's forces was just beyond the horizon, and both sides knew it. In a desperate attempt to avoid a war, Gage drew up a plan to stop the buildup of colonial arms by securing a fort 50 miles north of Boston in New Hampshire, Fort William and Mary. When a Patriot spy learned of the new plan, he knew it was time to act. If Gage's forces took control of the New Hampshire fort, then it would significantly damage the Patriots' plan for war. The plan being was to raid the royal arsenals across the colonies when hostilities worsened. This new development forced the Patriots' hand, and a meeting of the Boston Committee of Correspondence was called. Early the next morning, the 13th of December, 1774, the committee sent out the local silversmith, Paul Revere, to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in order to warn the local militia that Gage's men were on their way to reinforce the forts. Revere would make the 60-mile journey and arrive in Portsmouth at 4 p.m. the same day. Upon arriving, Revere found local Patriot leader Samuel Cutts at a local tavern and informed him of the immediate threat. Despite the attempt at secrecy, a local loyalist overheard the meeting and ran to the governor, John Wentworth, who then sent word to General Gage. In response, Gage dispatched Marines to the fort to settle the situation. The stage has now been set. An emergency meeting of the Committee of Correspondence was called by Cutts, but no plan could be made. Instead, all it did was inspire a few patriots to take matters into their own hands. Early the next morning, the 14th of December, drums could be heard in town as they called fellow patriots into the streets and formed a mob. At noon, the mob numbered 100 and began marching towards the fort, led by a patriot named John Langdon. The mob gathered in boats and sailed down the river towards the forts, and by the time they arrived, their numbers had grown to about 400. At the time, Fort William and Mary was commanded by Captain John Cochran and a small garrison of 5 men. When Captain Cochran saw the boats approaching, he told his men not to flinch on pain of death and defend the fort to the last extremity. When the Patriots arrived at the fort, Captain Cochran told the men in the boats to turn back at threat of violence. Landon called back for a parley to speak his grievances. Cochran agreed. The two leaders met within the walls of the fort, where Landon told Cochran directly that his men were going to take the gunpowder and to back down. Cochran responded saying that if they attempted, then blood would be spilt, then promptly asked the men to leave. Shortly after getting back outside, Landon's men charged Fort William and Mary. Captain Cochran and his 5 men attempted to defend the fort with musket and cannon fire, thus letting loose the first shots of the revolution. While soldiers reloaded, the Patriots got closer. Cochrane and his men resorted to hand-in-hand combat to defend the fort. The battle was tense, but ultimately, no one sustained more than a non-lethal bayonet injury to the arm. Captain Cochrane was subdued and offered to surrender his sword, but it was not actually taken by the Patriots. Alexander Scammell took down the British colors over the fort, marking the first time colonial patriots would take down a British flag. Once the fort was taken by the mob of patriots, they broke open the powder house and loaded up nearly 100 barrels of gunpowder into their boats. Now, with their loot in hand, the Patriots released their surrendered soldiers and sailed back to town. The next day, December 15th, some of the men decided that they needed more than just powder from the fort. Local lawyer John Sullivan rounded up a group of 100 men and pushed off from Portsmouth for Fort William and Mary. Sullivan and his men arrived at 10 p.m. at night and asked to enter into the fort. Captain Cochrane agreed. Sullivan and Cochrane met inside the fort just a day after it was stormed by the same mob. Despite Cochrane's suspicion of Sullivan, the two struck a deal. When the gates were opened to allow Sullivan out of the base, the entire mob stormed in. The men had no intention to take the fort over, though. All they wanted was everything that wasn't bolted to the ground. By 8 a.m. the next morning, the mob had taken every musket, cannon, cartridge, and broken firearm within the fort, leaving only the heavy cannons as they would not fit in the boats. 2 days later, December 17th, a British naval ship, HMS Canco, arrived at Fort William and Mary, where they discovered what had happened just days before. When word made it back to England of the mob's acts, it was declared high treason, and Royal Governor Wentworth was to gather evidence against the mob. Later, Wentworth and his family would be driven out of Portsmouth and forced to live in Fort William and Mary with Captain Cochrane. No one would ever be arrested for sacking the fort, and all of the powder would be redistributed to the local town militias. The preamble of the revolution is now over. Shots have been fired, a fort has fallen, and the British colors taken down. The Patriots are armed and ready. Meanwhile, England has declared them traitors. Only one more thing sits upon the horizon.